The sharp crack of a gavel cut through the dusty air of Silverwater's makeshift auction house as Elizabeth Rose's tears fell silently onto the wooden floorboards. The year was 1876, and everything she had ever known was being sold to the highest bidder. "Next up, the Rose homestead and all its contents," announced the auctioneer, a thin man with calculating eyes and a voice that carried across the crowded room. "Starting bid at $50. Elizabeth clutched her handkerchief tightly, knuckles white with strain. Just 3 weeks ago, her father had been laid to rest beside her mother in the small cemetery on the edge of town. The bank had wasted no time in calling in his debts, leaving her with nothing but the clothes on her back and the small leather pouch of her mother's jewelry that she'd managed to hide away. "Look at her, crying like that'll change something," a voice sneered from behind. "Tears won't pay your daddy's debts, girl," another added with a harsh laugh. Elizabeth kept her eyes fixed on the floor, unable to watch as pieces of her life were parceled off to strangers. 22 years of memories being dismantled before her very eyes. She had tried everything to save the homestead, taking in mending, selling eggs from their few remaining chickens, even offering to work for the banker himself. But Mr. Harrison had simply smiled that cold smile of his and told her that business was business. $60, called a voice from the back. 75, countered another. The bidding continued, each increase driving the knife deeper into Elizabeth's heart. These people weren't just buying her home, they were buying her past, her security, her very identity. $100, called a gruff voice that Elizabeth didn't recognize. "The lady's still crying," someone jeered. "Maybe we should auction off those tears too." Laughter rippled through the crowd, and Elizabeth felt her cheeks burn with humiliation. She had promised herself she wouldn't cry, wouldn't give them the satisfaction, but the tears came unbidden as the last threads of her dignity unraveled. "Those tears are gold," came a deep voice from the doorway. The room fell silent as everyone turned to look at the newcomer. He stood tall against the brightness of the day outside, his silhouette framed by the doorway. As he stepped into the auction house, Elizabeth could see he was a stranger to Silverwater, a cowboy with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of a summer storm. "Worth more than anything you vultures are bidding on today," the cowboy continued, walking forward with a deliberate stride. His spurs clinked softly against the wooden floor, punctuating the silence he had created. $200 for the homestead. A collective gasp rose from the crowd. It was nearly double the current bid. $200 going once, the auctioneer said quickly, excitement coloring his voice. $250, countered Harrison, the banker, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. $300, the cowboy replied without hesitation. Elizabeth stared at the stranger, confusion mingling with her grief. Who was this man? Why would he pay such an outrageous sum for a modest homestead, $300 going once, going twice? "Sold to the gentleman in the doorway," the auctioneer declared, bringing his gavel down with a decisive crack. The cowboy nodded and approached the auctioneer's table, pulling out a leather wallet from inside his coat. He counted out the bills methodically, seemingly oblivious to the curious stares directed his way. "What's your name, sir?" the auctioneer asked, preparing his ledger. Forrest Cooper," the cowboy replied, his eyes finding Elizabeth's for the first time. Something in that gaze, a mixture of determination and kindness, made her breath catch. With the transaction complete, the auctioneer moved on to the next item, but the crowd's attention remained divided between the ongoing auction and the mysterious cowboy who had paid a fortune for the Rose homestead. Forrest made his way through the onlookers until he stood before Elizabeth. "Miss Rose," he said with a slight tip of his hat, "I believe we have some matters to discuss regarding your property." "My property," Elizabeth repeated, confused, "but if you'll accompany me outside," he interrupted gently, offering his arm. Too stunned to refuse, Elizabeth placed her trembling hand on his arm and allowed him to lead her out into the afternoon sunshine. The spring air was crisp and clean after the stuffiness of the auction house, and she took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "Mr. Cooper, I don't understand," she said once they were away from prying ears. "That homestead is no longer mine. You purchased it fair and square." Forrest's weather-beaten face softened. "Miss Rose, I have a proposition for you. But first, might I suggest we find somewhere more comfortable to talk? The saloon serves a decent coffee." Elizabeth hesitated. A respectable woman didn't simply walk into a saloon with a man she had just met. But then again, what did she have left to lose? "Very well," she agreed, "but I would prefer to know your intentions sooner rather than later." Forrest smiled a genuine smile that reached his eyes and transformed his face. "All in good time, Miss Rose. All in good time." The Silver Dollar Saloon was relatively quiet in the mid-afternoon lull. A few regulars nursed their drinks at the bar, while a table of men played cards in the corner. Heads turned as Elizabeth entered alongside Forrest, but he guided her to a table at the back with a protective demeanor that discouraged any comments. "2 coffees," he told the bartender, who nodded and set about brewing the drinks. Elizabeth sat stiffly, her back straight and her eyes wary. "Mr. Cooper, you now own my family's homestead. I cannot imagine what proposition you could have for me." Forrest removed his hat and set it on the table, revealing thick dark hair streaked with silver at the temples. Up close, Elizabeth guessed him to be in his early 30s, older than her, but not by as much as she had initially thought. "I've been riding for 3 days straight to get to this auction, Miss Rose," he said, rubbing a hand over his face. "I was afraid I'd be too late." "Too late for what?" she asked, increasingly bewildered. The bartender arrived with their coffees, and Forrest waited until the man had retreated before continuing. "Your father, Jonathan Rose, saved my life during the war. We served together at Shiloh." Elizabeth's eyes widened. "My father never spoke much about the war." "Many don't," Forrest replied quietly. "Some memories are best left buried, but your father was a good man, the best kind of man. When I took a Confederate bullet to the shoulder, he carried me 2 miles to the field hospital, under fire the whole way." He paused, taking a sip of his coffee. "I made him a promise that day. I told him if he ever needed anything, I'd be there. We kept in touch over the years, just letters now and then. His last letter reached me a month ago, telling me about his illness and his worries for you." Elizabeth felt a fresh wave of grief wash over her. "He knew he was dying," she whispered, "but he tried to hide it from me until the end. He asked me to look after you if anything happened to him," Forrest continued. "I set out as soon as I received word of his passing, but I was in Colorado territory. By the time I arrived in Silverwater, the auction notices were already posted." "So you bought the homestead, for me?" Elizabeth asked, struggling to comprehend his generosity. "In a manner of speaking," Forrest replied. "My proposition is this. The deed will be in my name, but the homestead remains your home. I'll help you get it running properly again, make it profitable so you can pay off your father's debts over time. And what do you get out of this arrangement, Mr. Cooper?" Elizabeth asked, suspicion creeping into her voice. She had encountered enough men with ulterior motives to know that generosity rarely came without expectations. Forrest met her gaze steadily. "I fulfill a promise to a man I respected more than any other. Beyond that, I've been drifting for years." "The idea of putting down some roots doesn't sound half bad. You intend to live at the homestead?" Elizabeth's voice rose slightly. "There's a perfectly good bunkhouse behind the barn," he said quickly. "I wouldn't dream of imposing on your privacy, Miss Rose." Elizabeth studied him, searching for deceit and finding none. Still, she had been raised to be practical. "Mr. Cooper, your offer is incredibly generous, but I can't accept charity. If we enter into this arrangement, I need to know I can repay you eventually." A smile tugged at the corner of Forrest's mouth. "I figured you'd say something like that. Your father mentioned you had his stubborn streak." He leaned forward, his voice taking on a more businesslike tone. "Here's what I propose. We work the land together, split the profits 50-50. When your half equals what I paid today, plus reasonable interest, the deed transfers fully to you. And if the land doesn't yield enough, Elizabeth challenged, then I've made a poor investment, Forrest shrugged, but I don't think that will happen. Your father always said that land had potential. Elizabeth fell silent, turning the proposition over in her mind. It seemed too good to be true, yet something about Forrest Cooper's straightforward manner inspired trust. Besides, what alternatives did she have? The position of schoolteacher was already filled, and the only other work for a single woman in Silverwater was either as a seamstress or at the saloon. "Very well, Mr. Cooper," she said at last, extending her hand across the table. "I accept your proposition." Forrest's large hand enveloped hers, warm and calloused. "Then we have a deal, Miss Rose." That handshake in the Silver Dollar Saloon marked the beginning of an unusual partnership that set tongues wagging throughout Silverwater. By sunset, Elizabeth had moved her few remaining possessions back into her childhood home, while Forrest Cooper settled into the small but sturdy bunkhouse with little more than his horse, his saddle, and a battered trunk containing his worldly possessions. The first weeks were awkward as they established boundaries and routines. Elizabeth continued to cook in the main house, insisting that Forrest join her for meals rather than fend for himself. In return, he tackled the endless list of repairs that had accumulated during her father's illness, mending fences, patching the roof, and shoring up the well. "Your father did the best he could," Forrest commented one evening as they sat on the porch after supper, the spring twilight settling around them. "But a homestead this size is hard for one man to maintain, especially when he's ailing." Elizabeth nodded, watching the fireflies begin to emerge from the tall grass. "He never complained, not once. Even at the end, he was more worried about me than himself." "He was right to worry," Forrest said quietly. "This is no country for a woman alone. I'm not exactly alone now, am I?" Elizabeth replied, glancing at him. Their eyes met briefly before Forrest looked away, clearing his throat. "No, I suppose not." As spring deepened into summer, they fell into a comfortable rhythm. Elizabeth tended to the garden and the chickens, while Forrest worked the fields and cared for the livestock. They had decided to focus on raising cattle rather than crops, as the rolling land of the homestead was better suited for grazing. "Cattle need less daily attention than crops," Forrest explained as they rode the property line one hot July afternoon. "And the railroad's pushing west. Beef prices are only going to rise." "How do you know so much about cattle?" Elizabeth asked, impressed by his knowledge. Forrest's expression grew distant. "I worked as a trail boss for a few years after the war, drove herds up from Texas to the railheads in Kansas." "Is that where you learned to be so?" She searched for the right word, commanding, like at the auction. A smile crossed his face. "Commanding, huh? I suppose dealing with 24 cowboys and 2,000 longhorns teaches a man to speak up or get trampled." Elizabeth laughed, the sound carrying across the open grassland. It struck her suddenly that she couldn't remember the last time she had laughed before Forrest arrived. Grief and worry had consumed her for so long that joy had seemed a distant memory. "It suits you," Forrest said softly. "What does?" Laughing, being happy. Elizabeth felt a blush rise to her cheeks and turned her face away, ostensibly to check the position of the sun. "It's getting late. We should head back." If Forrest noticed her sudden discomfort, he didn't comment on it. Instead, he pointed to a distant cluster of trees. "That would be a good spot to clear for the new corral. What do you think?" Elizabeth was grateful for the change of subject. "I trust your judgment." "You're the cattle expert. It's your land, Elizabeth," he reminded her gently. It was the first time he had used her given name, and something about the way it sounded in his deep voice made her heart skip a beat. "Your opinion matters. Our land," she corrected him, "at least for now." They rode back to the homestead in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. For Elizabeth, those thoughts were increasingly confusing. She had accepted Forrest's proposition out of necessity, seeing him as her father's friend and her own benefactor. But somewhere between the shared meals and the long talks on the porch, something had shifted. She found herself looking forward to his company, noticing the way the sun brought out the auburn highlights in his dark hair, or how his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. Such thoughts were dangerous. Forrest had never indicated any interest beyond their business arrangement and his obligation to her father. Getting attached would only lead to heartache when their partnership eventually ended. As summer faded into autumn, the homestead began to show signs of prosperity. The vegetable garden yielded a bountiful harvest, the chicken coop was full, and a small herd of cattle now grazed in the pastures. Elizabeth had begun selling eggs, butter, and vegetables in town, slowly building up their savings. It was on one such trip to town in early October that she encountered Harrison, the banker, outside the general store. "Miss Rose," he greeted her with a tight smile. "I must say you're looking well. Country living agrees with you." "Thank you, Mr. Harrison," Elizabeth replied coolly, preparing to move past him. "That cowboy of yours seems to be making improvements to the old place," Harrison continued, blocking her path slightly. "Quite the fortunate arrangement for you." The emphasis he placed on arrangement made Elizabeth's skin crawl. "Mr. Cooper is an honorable man fulfilling a promise to my father," she said firmly. Harrison raised an eyebrow. "Indeed, how chivalrous of him. Though I wonder what the good Reverend would say about an unmarried woman living with a man, promise or no promise." "We live separately, as you well know," Elizabeth retorted, her temper flaring. "Mr. Cooper stays in the bunkhouse." Of course," Harrison said with a dismissive wave. "Still, reputations are fragile things, Miss Rose. I would hate to see yours tarnished by misconceptions." "Are you threatening me, Mr. Harrison?" Elizabeth asked, keeping her voice low despite her anger. The banker's smile widened. "Not at all. Merely expressing concern for your standing in the community. After all, Silverwater is a small town, and people do talk." "People like you mean," Elizabeth said bitterly. "I'm simply suggesting that your unusual living situation might be viewed more favorably if it were." "Legitimized somehow," Harrison said, his tone deceptively pleasant. "Unless, of course, you'd consider a more conventional solution. My offer of marriage still stands despite your previous refusal." Elizabeth felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn breeze. Harrison had proposed to her shortly after her father's death, making it clear that marriage to him would solve her financial troubles. She had rejected him then, and the thought of being tied to him was even more repulsive now. "Thank you for your concern, Mr. Harrison," she said stiffly, "but I am perfectly content with my current situation." "For now, perhaps," Harrison conceded, finally stepping aside to let her pass. "But winter is coming, Miss Rose. Things may look different when the snow falls." Elizabeth hurried through the rest of her errands, Harrison's thinly veiled threats echoing in her mind. By the time she headed back to the homestead, dark clouds were gathering on the horizon, mirroring her mood. Forrest was mending tack in the barn when she returned, and he looked up with a smile that quickly faded when he saw her expression. "What happened?" he asked, setting aside his work. Elizabeth hesitated, then recounted her encounter with Harrison. Forrest's face darkened as she spoke, his hands clenching into fists. "That snake," he muttered when she finished. "He's still bitter that I outbid him for the homestead." "It's not just that," Elizabeth said, sinking onto a bale of hay. "He's right about one thing people are talking. Mrs. Peterson at the general store barely spoke to me today, and Reverend Phillips made a point of asking about my living arrangements after church last Sunday." Forrest ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "I should have anticipated this. Small towns run on gossip. What are we going to do?" Elizabeth asked, hating the vulnerability in her voice. Forrest was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on some distant point. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. "There's a simple solution if you'd consider it." Elizabeth's heart stuttered. "What solution?" "We could marry," he said matter-of-factly, as if suggesting they plant corn instead of wheat. A marriage of convenience to silence the gossip and protect your reputation. Elizabeth stared at him, unable to form a coherent response. Of all the solutions she had considered, this one hadn't crossed her mind, or perhaps she hadn't allowed it to. Forrest mistook her silence for rejection and quickly continued. It wouldn't change anything practically. You'd have your house, I'd have the bunkhouse. We'd continue our partnership as before, but with the legal protection of marriage. You would do that, Elizabeth finally managed. Tie yourself to me just to stop people from talking. Something flickered in Forrest's eyes, an emotion she couldn't quite name. I made a promise to your father to protect you. This seems the most effective way to do that. A promise, Elizabeth repeated, the words tasting bitter. Of course. Forrest stood up, brushing hay from his pants. Think about it, there's no rush to decide. But there was, Elizabeth realized as she watched him walk away. Harrison's threat hung in the air like the approaching storm. If she rejected Forrest's practical solution, what other options did she have? That night, as rain lashed against her bedroom window, Elizabeth tossed and turned, her mind racing. Marriage to Forrest would solve her immediate problems, but at what cost to her heart? She had already begun to care for him more than was wise. Living as his wife, even in name, would deepen those feelings. And when he eventually moved on, as men like him always did, the pain would be unbearable, yet the alternative was equally unpalatable. If the town turned against her completely, their business would suffer. And if Harrison decided to make good on his implicit threats, she could lose everything again. By morning, she had made her decision. She found Forrest in the kitchen, making coffee as the sun broke through the clouds after the storm. Yes, she said without preamble. Forrest turned, coffee pot in hand, confusion written across his features. Yes, I'll marry you, Elizabeth clarified, her voice steadier than she felt. For convenience's sake, something that might have been disappointment flashed across Forrest's face before he nodded. All right then. I'll ride into town today and speak with the Reverend. Thank you, Elizabeth said formally, as if he'd offered to fetch supplies rather than become her husband. Elizabeth, Forrest said, setting down the coffee pot and taking a step toward her. I want you to know that I'll honor you as my wife in every way that counts. You'll never have reason to regret this decision. The sincerity in his voice made her throat tighten. I know, she whispered, and then fled to the safety of the garden before her emotions could betray her. They were married 3 days later in a brief ceremony at the small church in Silverwater. Elizabeth wore her mother's blue dress, the only good dress she owned, and Forrest looked almost uncomfortable in a clean shirt and string tie. Reverend Phillips seemed relieved rather than suspicious about their sudden decision, suggesting that perhaps Harrison's influence hadn't spread as far as Elizabeth had feared. You may kiss the bride, the Reverend announced at the conclusion of the ceremony. Forrest hesitated, his eyes questioning as they met Elizabeth's. She gave a small nod, and he leaned down to place a gentle, chaste kiss on her lips there first. It was over in an instant, but Elizabeth felt it like a brand upon her heart. Congratulations, Mrs. Cooper, Forrest said quietly as they left the church. Mrs. Cooper. The name felt foreign, yet not entirely unwelcome. They rode back to the homestead, their homestead in the wagon Forrest had borrowed for the occasion, making stilted conversation about the weather and the cattle. To Elizabeth's surprise, Forrest insisted on carrying her across the threshold when they arrived home. For luck, he explained with a small smile. The gesture, though traditional, felt oddly intimate. As Forrest set her down in the parlor, his hands lingered at her waist for a moment longer than necessary. Elizabeth stepped back quickly, smoothing her dress with nervous hands. I should start supper, she said, needing some task to occupy her. I'll see to the animals, Forrest replied, equally eager for the familiar routine. That night, after a wedding supper that neither of them ate much of, Forrest returned to the bunkhouse as agreed. Elizabeth stood at her bedroom window, watching his lantern light glowing in the darkness, wondering if he felt as confused as she did. They were married, yet not truly husband and wife. It was a solution to a problem, nothing more, so why did it feel like everything had changed? The winter of 1876 was harsh, with howling blizzards that kept them homebound for days at a time. During these storms, Forrest moved temporarily into the spare room of the main house, a practical decision to conserve firewood and for safety's sake. These periods of forced proximity gradually wore away the awkwardness between them, replacing it with a deeper familiarity. They spent long evenings by the fire, Forrest whittling or cleaning his guns while Elizabeth sewed or read aloud from one of the few books they owned. Sometimes they simply talked about their childhoods, their hopes, the future of the homestead. Forrest proved to be an attentive listener and a thoughtful conversationalist, his quiet nature balanced by unexpected flashes of humor. "Where did you go after the war?" Elizabeth asked one snowy evening in January. "Before you became a trail boss, I mean." Forrest's hands stilled on the piece of wood he was carving. "Home to Kentucky at first, but it wasn't home anymore, not really. Too many ghosts. Your family, gone. Pa died before the war. Ma and my younger sister died of typhoid while I was fighting." His voice was matter of fact, but Elizabeth could hear the old pain beneath the words. "I'm sorry," she said softly. Forrest shrugged. "It was a long time ago. After that, I just drifted. Worked ranches in Texas, drove cattle, tried my hand at prospecting in Colorado for a spell. Never stayed anywhere long enough to put down roots." "Until now," Elizabeth observed. Forrest looked up, meeting her gaze across the room. "Until now," he agreed. That night, lying in her bed listening to the wind howl outside, Elizabeth admitted to herself what she had been trying to deny for months. She was falling in love with her husband. Not just attraction or gratitude, but a deep, abiding love that terrified her with its intensity. Their marriage might have begun as a matter of convenience, but her feelings were anything but convenient. The question that kept her awake long into the night was whether Forrest could ever feel the same way, or if she would forever be merely an obligation, the daughter of a man who once saved his life. As winter slowly gave way to spring, Elizabeth noticed subtle changes in Forrest's behavior. He found more excuses to be near her, his hand occasionally brushing hers as they worked side by side. His eyes followed her around the room, and sometimes she would look up to find him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. Hope blossomed in her heart like the first crocuses pushing through the melting snow, but she dared not nurture it too openly. Pride and fear kept her silent, waiting for some clearer sign of his feelings. That sign came unexpectedly in April, when Elizabeth rode into town for supplies. As she loaded her purchases into the wagon, she overheard two women talking nearby. "Did you hear about Forrest Cooper?" one asked the other. "Turned down Julia Winter's flat when she offered to help with his spring planting. Can you blame him?" the second woman replied. "Pretty young wife at home. Why would he look twice at Julia?" "That's just it," the first woman continued, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "Sarah Peterson says they don't even share a bedroom, claims it's a marriage in name, only something about saving the girl's reputation." Elizabeth froze, her hand tightening on the sack of flour she was loading. "Well, if that's true, he's a fool," the second woman declared. Elizabeth Rose was always a pretty thing, even when she was crying at that auction. "Remember how Cooper stood up for her? Those tears are gold," he said. "Never saw a man fall harder or faster. You think he loved her even then, plain as day to anyone with eyes. Why else would he pay $300 for that run-down homestead?" Elizabeth didn't wait to hear more. She finished loading her supplies with trembling hands and headed home, her mind racing. Could it be true? Had Forrest feelings for her beyond obligation and friendship? She found him mending the pasture fence when she returned, his shirt sleeves rolled up to expose sun-browned forearms as he worked. He looked up at her approach, a smile warming his features. "You're back early," he observed, hammering one last nail into place before setting his tools aside. "Everything all right in town?" Elizabeth didn't answer immediately, her courage faltering now that she faced him. Instead, she blurted out, "Did you mean it? What you said at the auction?" Forrest's brow furrowed. "What I said about my tears," Elizabeth clarified, her cheeks heating, "that they were gold." Something shifted in Forrest's expression, surprise, followed by a vulnerability she had never seen before. "You heard that. Everyone heard it," she said quietly. "I just never understood why you would say such a thing." Forrest rubbed the back of his neck, a gesture she had come to recognize as a sign of his discomfort. "I didn't plan to say anything, but seeing you there hurting with those vultures mocking you," he shook his head. "It made me angry, and then the words just came out. Did you mean them?" Elizabeth pressed, needing to know. Forrest was silent for a long moment, his eyes never leaving hers. "Yes," he finally said, his voice low and certain. "I meant them. Your tears, your feelings, they were more precious than anything being sold that day, including this land." Elizabeth took a step closer, her heart pounding. "Is that why you paid so much? Because of me? Your father asked me to look after you," Forrest said, but there was a hesitation in his voice that hadn't been there before. "Is that the only reason?" Elizabeth whispered. The question hung between them, charged with all the unspoken feelings of the past months. Forrest closed the distance between them in 2 strides, his hands coming up to cradle her face with exquisite gentleness. "No," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "From the moment I saw you at that auction, something changed in me. I told myself it was just the need to fulfill my promise to your father, but..." He trailed off, searching her eyes. "It was always more than that." "Why didn't you say anything?" Elizabeth asked, hardly daring to breathe. "How could I?" Forrest's thumbs traced the curve of her cheekbones. "I bought your homestead. I offered marriage to protect your reputation. I was afraid you would think I was collecting on a debt, or that you'd feel obligated. Elizabeth repeated, a small, incredulous laugh escaping her. "Forrest Cooper, I have been falling in love with you since the day you carried me across that threshold." Forrest's expression transformed, hope blazing in his eyes. "Elizabeth," he murmured, and then he was kissing her, not the brief, formal kiss of their wedding, but a real kiss, tender and passionate all at once. When they finally parted, both breathless, Forrest rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he said simply. "I think I have from the first moment I saw you." "Even with tears streaming down my face," Elizabeth teased gently. "Especially then," Forrest smiled. "Those tears were gold to me because they showed your heart, and what a heart it is, Elizabeth Cooper." That night, for the first time, they truly became husband and wife. Forrest moved his few possessions from the bunkhouse into the main house, and they began their life together in earnest, not as business partners or friends, but as a couple deeply in love. News of their changed relationship spread quickly through Silverwater, putting an end to the rumors once and for all. Even Harrison had to grudgingly accept their legitimate union, though he maintained a cool distance whenever their paths crossed in town. As spring blossomed into summer, the homestead flourished under their combined efforts. The cattle herd grew, the vegetable garden expanded, and they even took on a ranch hand to help with the increased workload. By the fall of 1877, they had earned enough to pay back half of Forrest's initial investment, though he insisted there was no rush. "The money doesn't matter," he told Elizabeth one evening as they sat on the porch swing he had built for her birthday. "This is our home now, yours and mine together." Elizabeth leaned against his shoulder, watching the sunset paint the prairie in shades of gold and crimson. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked. "The drifting, I mean, the freedom to go wherever the wind takes you." Forrest's arm tightened around her shoulders. "Not for a single moment," he said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I drifted because I had nowhere to belong. Now I do." In December of that year, Elizabeth discovered she was expecting their first child. Forrest's joy knew no bounds. He practically floated through the winter months, making plans and building a cradle with his own hands. "What if it's a girl?" Elizabeth asked as she watched him sanding the wood to a silky finish. "Then she'll be as beautiful and strong as her mother," Forrest replied without hesitation. "And I'll teach her to ride and shoot just the same as I would a son." Elizabeth laughed. "And if the town disapproves, let them talk," Forrest said with a dismissive wave. "Haven't we proved by now that what others think doesn't matter?" The baby, a daughter they named Sarah, after Forrest's mother arrived in early August of 1878. She had her father's dark hair and her mother's determined chin, and from the moment she took her first breath, she had both her parents wrapped around her tiny fingers. "She's perfect," Forrest whispered, cradling his daughter with a tenderness that brought tears to Elizabeth's eyes. Just like her mother. As Sarah grew from infant to toddler, the homestead continued to prosper. By her second birthday, they had fully repaid Forrest's investment and had money in the bank besides. They celebrated by hosting a harvest dinner for the entire community. Even Harrison received an invitation, though he declined with a polite note. "You've proved them all wrong," Forrest told Elizabeth that night as they stood on the porch after their guests had departed. "Everyone who doubted you could make this place work." Elizabeth smiled, watching the moonlight silver the land that stretched before them, their land, now and forever. "We proved them wrong," she corrected him. "Together." Forrest pulled her close, his lips finding hers in a kiss that, even after 3 years of marriage, still made her heart race. "Together," he agreed when they parted, "just like those tears of yours turned to gold." In the years that followed, the Cooper homestead became one of the most successful in the county. They added to their house as their family grew, first with twins James and John in 1881, and finally with little Catherine in 1884. The bunkhouse was expanded to accommodate the additional ranch hands they hired, and a proper barn replaced the old structure that had been standing since Elizabeth's father first claimed the land. Harrison eventually left Silverwater for Denver, his ambitions outgrowing the small town. Before he departed, he stopped by the homestead one afternoon, hat in hand. "I came to say goodbye," he told Elizabeth, looking uncomfortable on her porch, "and to apologize for my behavior toward you in the past." Elizabeth, bouncing Catherine on her hip, studied him for a moment before nodding. "Apology accepted, Mr. Harrison. I wish you well in Denver." "You've built something remarkable here," Harrison admitted, his gaze taking in the prosperous homestead. "You and Cooper both." "We have," Elizabeth agreed simply. After Harrison left, Forrest found her still standing on the porch, a thoughtful expression on her face. "Everything all right?" he asked, taking Catherine from her arms and tickling the little girl until she giggled. "Just thinking," Elizabeth replied, leaning into his side, "about how differently things might have turned out if you hadn't arrived at that auction." "But I did arrive," Forrest reminded her, his arm circling her waist, "right on time to see those golden tears." Elizabeth smiled up at him, her heart still filling with love at the sight of this man who had saved her in more ways than one. "And now look at us. 4 beautiful children, land as far as the eye can see, and enough love to last a lifetime." "More than enough," Forrest agreed, bending to kiss her softly. "Those tears really did turn to gold, my love. Everything we touch together turns to gold." As the sun set over their homestead, painting the sky in the same fiery colors as on that long-ago day when they had first acknowledged their love, Elizabeth knew that Forrest was right. From her darkest moment, tears falling on the auction house floor, as strangers mocked her pain, had come the greatest happiness she could have imagined. A cowboy had seen the value in her tears, in her strength, in her very self when no one else did. And together they had indeed turned those tears to gold. By 1890, the Cooper Ranch was known throughout the territory. They had expanded to over 1,000 acres, running several hundred head of cattle and employing a dozen ranch hands. Their children were growing up strong and confident. Sarah, at 12, was already showing signs of being a savvy businesswoman like her mother, while the 10-year-old twins had inherited their father's way with horses. Little Catherine, at 6, was the darling of the ranch, equally comfortable helping her mother with household tasks or following her father around the property. Silverwater had grown as well, the railroad finally reaching the town in 1885. The arrival of the train brought new opportunities and new faces, expanding the once tiny community into a proper town with a school, a hotel, and even a small theater. Through all the changes, Elizabeth and Forrest remained each other's constant partners in every sense of the word. They had faced droughts and blizzards, market fluctuations and family illnesses, but always together, drawing strength from their love and the life they had built. On the 15th anniversary of their wedding, Forrest surprised Elizabeth by taking her back to the spot where he had first told her he loved her, the pasture fence that had long since been replaced with sturdier materials. "You remember?" he asked, his hair now liberally streaked with silver, though his eyes remained as keen and kind as ever. "How could I forget?" Elizabeth replied, her hand finding his as naturally as breathing. At 37, she was still beautiful, the years adding character to her face rather than diminishing her loveliness. That was the day our life together truly began. Forrest pulled her into his arms, still as strong and solid as the day they met. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket to withdraw a small velvet pouch. Elizabeth raised an eyebrow. "What's this? Open it," Forrest urged. Inside the pouch, she found a delicate gold necklace from which hung a teardrop-shaped pendant. As she examined it more closely, she realized with a start that the pendant contained an actual teardrop preserved somehow within the gold setting. "Forrest," she breathed, looking up at him in wonder. "How is this possible?" He smiled, the expression still making her heart skip after all these years. "Remember last year when you cried at Sarah's birthday because she was growing up so fast? I caught one of your tears on my handkerchief. Had it preserved by that jeweler who came through town last month." "You saved my tear?" Elizabeth asked, deeply moved. "I told you they were gold," Forrest said softly, taking the necklace from her hands and moving behind her to fasten it around her neck. "Now you'll always have the proof." Elizabeth touched the pendant where it nestled against her skin, overcome with emotion. "I love you, Forrest Cooper," she whispered, turning to face him, more with each passing day. "And I love you, Elizabeth Cooper," he replied, drawing her close. "My gold, my heart, my home." As the sun set over the land they had nurtured together, casting long shadows across the prosperous ranch that had once been a struggling homestead, Elizabeth knew with absolute certainty that those mocking voices at the auction had been wrong about everything. Her tears hadn't been weakness, they had been strength. They had drawn to her the one man who could see their true value, who would cherish rather than dismiss them. Those tears, indeed, had been gold, the beginning of a love story that would be told in their family for generations to come. The tale of a weeping woman, a principled cowboy, and the empire they built together from nothing but courage, determination, and a love as enduring as the land itself.